We're live.
Good afternoon to those joining us from across the UK and Europe. Good morning to those joining us in North America, be this the US or into Canada. I'm Maurice Evan-Buffett and I'm the CEO of Armstrong Wolf. We are on day 2 of our annual 3-day Conduct and Culture Summit, this year's title being Purpose Over Profit. To date, I think we've held now 11 different webinars, had tremendous sort of participation from some of the leading voices across the industry. And today we are further joined by participants of the industry and also delighted to have Dane and Mike joining us from Control Risk. Before going on to the details about this specific session, I'm going to do the roundtable virtual introductions. So first of all, Simon.
Simon Longdon, a partner at Armstrong Wolf, formerly a banker, 35 years with Stanchart, Asia, Africa, Middle East, Geographic COO, Conduct and Investigations.
Thank you, Simon. Siobhan.
Good morning, Siobhan Dunn, Dunn by Dunn Consulting. I'm a managing partner. I started my career trading mortgage treasury options. I moved into the COO space to help bring conduct and culture controls to risk in a pragmatic way, and I continue that journey today.
Thanks, Siobhan. Dane.
Morning, Dane Chamorro, partner at Control Risk, based in Washington, DC.
Marianne.
Hello, Marianne Nichols. I'm head of global intelligence and threat analysis at Invesco. Before that, I spent time as a political analyst at Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, and then spent some time over at FBI.
Thank you, Marianne. Mike.
Good morning or good afternoon, everybody, depending where you're dialing in from. My name is Mike Wolf. I'm a partner at Control Risks, and I run the DC office for Control Risks and look after the southeast of the USA from a markets perspective. Been with the firm nearly 15 years, of which 1.5 has been here in the USA, and prior to that, I spent 13.5 years with the firm in the Middle East and North Africa.
I'm awfully sorry, I lost connectivity there. Mike, I presume that you finished the introduction. I just actually lost connectivity. I'm back.
Yeah, that's done, Maurice. All done. Ready to go.
Thanks. Sorry about that, ladies and gentlemen. That's the byproduct of living in a virtual world. Today's session is really talking about the evolution of threat management and addressing strategic risk in a post-pandemic world. To put this in context, a number of the sessions that we've actually had over the last 12 months, the debate has increasingly been around the evolving role and the importance of the COO, moving from a hindsight to a foresight perspective and looking from an anticipatory perspective. Alongside this, we'd already identified last year that as the COO came into focus, the platform, the COO became far more visible in line with the COO's role of mobilizing the workforce to take it into a desiccated workforce pattern. We then started to question actually where the lack of preparedness in relation to dealing with the pandemic itself. You could argue that whether it's governmental or whether it's corporate or commerce and industry, there was a comprehensive lack of imagination in relation to addressing or potentially looking at plans in place to deal with the pandemic. We held a series of sessions last year discussing what was complementary to or additive to the traditional view around non-financial risk management. And those sessions were granular. They talked about cyber risk, internal and external, and they talked about sort of monetary risk. They talked about geopolitical risk. And what became clear is that whether it's the buy or sell side, there wasn't one organization that could hang its hat on the peg and say that we were fully prepared in relation to the pandemic. And actually then extrapolated that into the level of preparedness in relation to dealing with the broader spectrum of strategic risk, or whatever strategic risk is. Over the last 9 or 10 months, we've continued to actually have the dialogue with a number of the COOs, as we said, buy and sell side, and to further investigate this. And we've now got to the point where aligned to this and running parallel was a series of forums looking at operational risk, operational resilience. And if you look in context to operational resilience, it actually notes the word threat. And therefore that we've seen a link in relation to what the role of the COO could be moving forward in a broader spectrum of looking forward in an anticipated manner in relation to threat management and strategic risk. So that's the background to where we are. But this initiative and this dialogue has really been driven by Simon, who introduced himself as a partner of Armstrong Wolf Partners, but actually I've known Simon for many years in his multiple roles at Standard Chartered Bank, and been first introduced to him when he was a global COO, and then Mike at Control Risk. So I think it's going to be better for me, Simon, to hand the baton to you to talk around the link into operational resilience, and then on to Mike. Simon.
Thanks, Maurice. Could we have the next slide up, please? The first slide. Thank you.
Next one.
So operational resilience. So the FCA defined operational resilience as the ability of a bank to deliver critical operations through disruption. This ability enables a bank to identify and protect itself from threats and potential failures, respond and adapt to, as well as recover and learn from disruptive events, including those just like COVID-19 that may be caused by matters that are outside of a firm's control. By the end of March next year, to comply with FCA guidelines on operational resilience, firms must have identified their important business services, set impact tolerances for the maximum disruption they can accept, and to have identified any vulnerabilities in their operational resilience plans. Going forward, they will then have to perform testing so that they're able to remain within the impact tolerances that have been set for each important business services during severe but plausible scenarios. So post-COVID, as Maurice said, one of the big questions increasingly raised by the COO community is how does the firm approach strategic risk to prevent a high level of disruption from happening again? And what should the role of the COO be? Now, while there are many functions involved in assessing the types of threats and risk that might impact a firm, the COO has a key role to play. The very nature of their role and their ability to take a broad and end-to-end perspective, they are very well placed to assess the extent to which risks have potential to disrupt delivery and to translate those into deliverable action plans. So a key role for the COO to help deliver the operational resilience plan. But before we explore this further, we do need to, it's important we work off an agreed language around what constitutes threat and risk, even if only for today. So Mike, do you want to explain what I mean by this?
Yeah, certainly, Simon, and thanks for that. You can bring up the next slide, Gwen. So as Simon said, these definitions here, we're only asking that we have some consistency in their use today. We fully understand that institutions will define these in different ways, but just for the sake of consistency today, this is what we're going to be working off. So when we're talking about threat, as you can see there, a factor or an event with the potential to cause the loss of damage to assets. But the important thing from a control risk perspective is we define threat as having a human base to it. And if it's got a human base to it, as part of any threat assessment, we need to be looking at the capability and the intent of those human actors. On the risk side of life, we talk about a potential event there that will have foreseeable consequences for assets. And that's going to result in impacts on objectives and success criteria. And like threats, these can be measured, and they need to be measured in terms of impact and likelihood. So when we're talking about threats, some examples could be activists of varying flavors, cyber criminals, fraudsters, insider threats, active shooters, the critical point there being that human element. On the risk side of life, clearly a huge array that we can draw from by way of examples that are relevant to financial services institutions, but that could involve regulatory changes, cyber breaches, natural disasters, fraud, contract breaches, government expropriation, and geopolitical instability. And the focus of the conversation we're going to be touching on today is more at the strategic end of that spectrum, and you can see the definition there. Those assumptions that sit at the very heart of an organization's strategy. And importantly, they can be both positive and negative in nature. When we talk about how you can sort of bucket strategic risks, normally you can drop them into one of those three. Positioning risk, are we where we need to be and in the right markets, and are we set up and aligned with our customers in those markets? From an execution risk perspective, do we have the right resources to execute on our strategy? So we're talking about the right people, the right facilities, the right partners, the right technology. And then lastly, consequence risks. What unintended events and consequences might occur as a result of the strategy that we're choosing to adopt? I think the point about managing strategic risks, it's not necessarily about prevention, but it's about anticipation and understanding of what might be coming down the pipe. That should then inform business leaders in respect of how they should respond, either by adjusting their strategy, increasing investment, enhancing internal capabilities, whatever that might look like, or sometimes even changing direction completely. And as Simon and Maurice have alluded to, when you think about threat, risk, and strategic risk in this way, all of them have quite clearly the impact, a potential impact on the COO's role and their ability to execute what they're being asked to execute. So I'm going to hand you back to Simon now, who's briefly going to cover off what we uncovered as a result of a survey we undertook within the COO community at the back end of 2020, asking some questions around this particular subject. So Simon, back to you.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Could we have the next slide, please? Thank you. So earlier this year, Armstrong Wolf produced a draft paper on threat and risk management, which included a summary from a survey we conducted with control risks last year to try and understand from the COO community, how can they establish a better understanding of the threat and risk landscape and what challenges do they foresee? The survey was very broad. It explored issues such as a view on the maturity and effectiveness of the risk management framework, the focus in risk meetings and the extent to which it was on the here and now versus considering emerging risks and horizon scanning, and the use of risk information within the firm and the confidence and quality in the data and analysis that accompanied it. Now, in summary, COOs were unanimous in the view that for their role to be most impactful, they require a broader and more informed view across risks and threat, which have the potential to impact their franchise. There's a real challenge, however, in that the prevalent use of people's time and the focus on risk meetings is on the here and now. Some firms have invested time and energy into considering emerging trends and horizon scanning, though they acknowledged it could be much more robust. And where it is conducted, it's much more focused on issues such as immediate reg change. So is it really considering the emerging landscape? Very much just focusing on the regulatory landscape around the corner. COOs see the ownership and stewardship of risk as a collective responsibility. And yes, there are specialists right across the firm that look at different issues, be it security risk, cyber risk, etc. But COOs were looking for the governance structure to provide them with a more holistic and informed view of the overall risk landscape so that they can fully consider its implications. But when it comes to making decisions, there are very often issues when it comes to the availability of the right information and data. A large number of those surveyed were not fully aware of the breadth and depth of risk information that might be available to them within the firm. They didn't necessarily fully understand how it was collated and analysed, did not always believe it was presented in a digestible format, and didn't always have full confidence in it. And there was consistent feedback that risk data and metrics are often very, very granular, and the information packs for meetings are often far too large, with concerns expressed about the ability to digest the contents fully beforehand. COOs want better structure and organisation of data, particularly with regard to the mapping of data into risks, to further aid their analysis, to enable them to get to the more material issues quickly. And if they can achieve that, it will free up valuable time for them to conduct more horizon scanning and to be considering the emerging risks and threats that are out there. Maurice, that's a quick summary of the survey findings.
Thank you very much, Simon. I think what we can do now is actually we can pivot into a panel discussion now. So hopefully you see what we've outlined there. That's the journey to date, in that we've got to the point where we speak to multiple COOs where they have a qualified interest in determining their role. First of all, determining the parameters or not of strategic risk, as we're calling it, and then actually looking to investigate their potential role in managing that additional risk. And or should it actually be, for example, to sit within the chief risk officer as opposed to the COO? All questions that we can come into. But if I just actually go first to Marianne. Marianne, you're one of the very few individuals that are sort of almost like a pathfinder. I just wonder if you could actually give an outline of the origin of your role, and actually the mandate and the input that you've actually had over the last 18 months. And that will probably help give some shape and form and further contextualize the discussion that we're having.
Absolutely, no, thank you. And everyone. So I think it would be helpful to kind of put a stage on where our team at Invesco sits and really complement the CRO role. So we report up to the chief admin officer, so we'll COO function. And we work very well with the CRO in that function. The CRO over strategic risk and enterprise risk, whereas our role is really strategic, but also tactical risk. And to kind of explain what I mean by that, if you look at China, for example, a number of years ago, my team was looking at information intelligence on China laying out a plan which, to implement what later became the China cybersecurity law. So with that, normally that's kind of found in the silo of legal and compliance to be looking at that issue. But what supports our team is to come in and really look at it, bring a holistic view and be very proactive, long ahead of those laws actually being implemented. And reaching out to technology, for example, they would need to be the ones that would have to implement these changes. Security from the security lens, the CRO from the risk lens, and of course the COO. So everyone has a very early understanding and holistic view of these issues. And what we do as well to make sure we're on the same page is we have a global intelligence briefing that we run 5 days a week to all employees. And in that briefing, we talk about articles such as one on China that we were talking about, what we're doing to mitigate and prepare for that topic, whatever the topic entails. And then we give it a rating, the methodology if it's a potential impact, direct impact, or informational. And so everyone has that information to say. At the end of the year, we go back through that briefing and we go through all the times that we talked about a certain topic. What do we rate them as far as impact? And that forms our strategic risk. And that didn't there in our annual assessment. We also give that data to the CRO to then filter into the corporate risk assessment. So that's kind of how we operate. If that's helpful.
Thank you very much, Marianne. Just in context of that, Simon, if I came back to you, I'm just wondering if you look back at your time, your degree of objectivity in relation to Standard Chartered Bank, did you actually have a structured approach to identifying, assessing, and monitoring what we defined as strategic risk? If you can take us back then and sort of say, well, how were you grappling with these different information feeds and risk dynamics?
It's a great question, Maurice. I mean, the reality of my perspective on that is when something is much more evident that it could be round the corner, like COVID. So yes, I was in Hong Kong at the time of SARS. So as soon as that hit, we were considering, what do we need to do to, remain in operation. But were we sat there at the time considering where that risk might sit there out on the horizon? The answer was no, we weren't. I think the key for me is it's having the awareness and visibility of the potential issues that might be out there, and understand, and being able to ask yourself the question of the so what, how might that impact us? What various scenarios might play out? You're not going to get it right every time, but if you can have visibility of things that are emerging out there in the market, perhaps a geopolitical issue in one of your main markets, and you can start to sort of run some scenarios. Actually, if A happens, the consequence might be B. Then you can start to think, are we ready for this if that happens? Do we have plans in place already? If we do, will they cover this scenario? If not, what might we need to do? I think the key is we need to look back at that definition from the FCA and the PRA, and they reference plausible scenarios. Things can happen that, it might not be COVID may not have been on the horizon, but it was certainly visible, a couple of months before it happened. How many people did plan for it? So are you doing that scenario planning, as it were, and considering the analysis? That for me is the piece that was missing. And, at the forefront, the information to tell me that it's out there as a potential issue.
Thank you, Simon. So do you then think that you've got the seat of objectivity? Now I'm going to come into Mike next and then on to Siobhan, because then Siobhan actually bridges into the role of the chief risk officer. Do you think, what sort of role do you think the COO could actually have in context to managing strategic risk or threat? My personal view is that the pandemic has actually re-emphasized or potentially emphasized the strength and the influence and the centralized platform of the COO, and it would appear to be well positioned to handle this risk. But actually, I'm quite interested in your view, having been a principal executive COO.
So I think the COO has a key, and I would go as far as say a critical role to play. Do I think they should own this as a challenge? I do not, because ultimately, if the ultimate goal here is to ensure a firm is delivering operational resilience, everyone at the C-suite level has a role to play in that. Ultimately, it might be owned by the chief risk officer themselves. The key behind the COO is they have a unique ability to look at an issue, look left, look right. They can have take a very broad perspective, and most importantly, take an end-to-end perspective. How might it impact the middle office? How might it impact the back office? What's the impact on the front office? It's that ability to look at an issue and try and translate it into actually the consequence could be X, therefore we need to respond by considering Y. That is a unique role that I think the COO is well placed to do. But they must be doing that in conjunction with the other C-suite execs. If it's a technology issue, the CIO needs to be there at the table. Cyber, the CISO needs to be at the table. But in translating into an action plan, that is where I think the COO has a critical role to play.
Thank you, Simon. Mike, you've sat and actually co-chaired multiple discussions now with the COO community of Armstrong Wolf, both buy and sell side. And this point of discussion about whether the COO has a role to play and or own has come up with many of those. What's your view, Mike, if you reflect on those conversations 12 months down from the original sort of 2 to 3 forums that we said?
I think the thing that struck me, Maurice, as a consequence of the discussions was the previous heavy focus on operational and regulatory risks that you alluded to earlier. That was sort of first and foremost amongst people's attention. But I think the COVID crisis has potentially changed the landscape in respect of what the COO's potential contribution could be. And it's brought into strong focus the topic of ownership, the topic of management, and does this or does this not bump into the CRO's responsibility? And I thought, Marianne touched on some interesting points on that side of life when she was explaining her organization's approach to that. But I think, the overarching conclusion is that people's eyes have got to lift and they have to be looking towards the horizon. They have to do that in a structured manner. They've got to have a means of identifying what those risks are. They've got to agree the language that they're using. They've got to understand what the process is around assessing those risks and then reviewing them on an ongoing basis. Because as you and I have discussed, Maurice, on many occasions, the landscape now, in particular, the role of technology within this, means that for whatever reason, some of these risks, they might be on the horizon one day, but within a relatively short period of time, woof, they're knocking on your door. So I think, that the speed that some of these problems, these risks can emerge and the level of impact that they can have on your organization can change very rapidly. So I definitely think it's incumbent upon organizations in the financial services community to perhaps lift their eyes from this operational and regulatory focus they've had to date and to be horizon scanning in a more effective manner, but they've got to do that in a structured way. And part of that structure is this COO, CRO discussion that I think Siobhan's probably going to have some good views on.
Thank you, Mike. Siobhan, perfectly introduced by Mike. Particularly, Sean, when you think about the executive role you held in context to operational risk before.
Yeah, you're right, Simon, and thank you all. I've had a unique experience where I've actually sat in the chair where I'm executing and trading and committing firm capital through these disasters. I've been a COO on a trading desk. I have run an operational risk department and I've run a business continuity. So this conversation really brings to the forefront that we all have a very unique role to play in thinking about what could happen and during the response to it. And as Mike was just saying about, it's about the speed and the velocity. It's also about the clarity of the communication and people understanding their roles. So one thing I think to say is we do a lot of thinking about what could happen. We play out the scenarios, but when reality hits, it's never exactly according to script. So you've always got to have that element of what's different. And I think the COO has a great ability to understand their business and be able to call the audible, if I can, on their business continuity plans. And people who are, running the threat and the crisis management, they're looking at a lot of their response in terms of how do I get us through this as quickly as I can and in a position for the most stable and quickest recovery to normal. People who are executing your business are really reliant on good communication so they know what to expect. And the COO can really enhance that dialogue by saying, we had planned for X, Y, and Z, but we got L and M as well. So with that actual scenario, we don't need this, we can give away that, this becomes more critical. And being able to help that reprioritization during the middle of the crisis, I think feeds the people who are prepping you for your recovery. It feeds the people who are trying to band-aid this together so you can function, because ultimately what you're trying to do is get your production people to deliver your services during the disruption. And the COO is really primed for that communication.
Thanks, Siobhan. I think one of the interesting things I've looked at is, the industry as a whole responded remarkably well to meet the challenge of the pandemic. I think there's almost like a danger of almost missing the point of the lack of preparedness for the pandemic itself, and actually the and actually how the industry actually managed to deal with the challenge, because there was a fundamental, process in anticipation of the pandemic. And I think even at Control Risk, you did a pandemic simulation in Asia around 2014-15. And it was, as we said, a failure of the imagination that pandemic happens every 100 years, but it doesn't mean that it happens every 100th year. In fact, there was 4 pandemics in the 20th century. If we then take out the pandemic and then we look into another risk, Dane, this is where I'd like to bring you into on the geopolitical side. And particularly, I think might be interested in relation to, say, a geopolitical risk at the moment, say, between the position between China and the US. From your experiences, Dane, when you're talking to the executive of your clients, how do they go about do you go about helping them translate these dynamics on the world stage into a material risk, and actually how they can anticipate it, or actually they don't? I'm just interested, and that will be a bridge to contextualize another example.
Yeah, thanks, Morris. I just want to make one comment. You mentioned the pandemic, and Simon had mentioned it before as well. And before I just came back to the US, I'd spent 30 years in Asia, half that time in Greater China. And to Simon's comment and yours about the infrequency of pandemics, in fact, they're much more frequent than I think everybody tends to think. And in fact, the year before this pandemic, swine flu was raging around Asia, having started in China, and it went to Vietnam and Korea and the Philippines. And so if there should have been a wake-up call, it should have been that. But to your question about strategic risk, what we've done, China is an interesting topic because it brings a lot of things. It brings geopolitics, as you mentioned. It brings compliance risk, and Marianne touched upon that with the CSL, the China cybersecurity law. It brings strategic risk and kind of ESG risk, for lack of a better word. As one of our colleagues likes to say, compliance is what you must do by law or regulation. Governance is what you ought to do. And that's a tricky one, because what you ought to do varies from individual to individual. It certainly varies from Beijing to Boston, right? Those two things will not be the same. And I think the last year or so, with respect to the US-China relationship and what's been happening in China particularly, really brings into a sharp focus what ought we to do. And what ought we to do in China will be very different from what we ought to do perhaps in the view of our stakeholders or our shareholders outside of China. So not too long ago, we did a task for an international bank in looking at China, and it's what we call future proofing. So we want to be in this market, the market being China. It's a tricky one from a compliance perspective, from a geopolitical perspective, from a governance perspective. How do we navigate that? And there's two parts to that. There's inbound and there's outbound. Inbound is, what could China do to us? How could we be exposed in China? And then there's the outbound piece, which is how what China does might affect our stakeholders or our shareholders in the ex-China world, which is a really interesting question. So I had this discussion the other day with a large pension fund, and they said, gee, we're really concerned about some of our China holdings because they might have exposure to that part of China called Xinjiang, which is in the far west, and where China has been criticized very publicly by a number of governments, including Canada and the UK and Australia and the United States, for human rights abuses. And I said, okay, well, I understand that. And you're not the only client that we've talked to that has those concerns. But what you're talking about is a very specific concern that we've invested in company X that's listed on whatever exchange, Hong Kong, Shanghai. It has, let's say it's buying cotton from Xinjiang or tomatoes from Xinjiang or whatever it might be. But you know what? I bet you're probably invested in China Telecom and ICBC and Bank of China and CNPC, because those are all big board listed Chinese companies. They all have a presence in Xinjiang. So where do you draw that line, right? And I would say helping our clients understand the nuance and the context of where do you draw that line for you, particularly for your shareholder, stakeholder base, and then also how a very complicated market like China will change and how you could be caught out in that change as a foreign operator in China. That's kind of typically the areas where we help.
How do they, where would they define, or where would they place this risk, Dane? Where do you find yourself talking to the chief risk officer, the CEO, the COO, all of them? And when you're saying, when it sits in someone's book of work, where does it, is it chief risk officer, or this, where does it sit?
It's a good question. It varies. So it could be ESG, it could be government affairs, it could be operational COO or country head or regional head. One of the things about particularly large financial institutions, as you guys know better than I do, they can be quite siloed. And this is one of the things that we found, particularly working on an engagement in China with the international bank that I mentioned, is many different silos doing different things in a rapidly expanding market. And there was not one kind of point of truth. There wasn't one part of the institution or one individual who knew what everybody was doing, which is one of our touch points for them, which is for a market like this, where because of your profile, you have a large exposure, you need to have one point of contact, and that might be a committee of 2 or 3 people, but you need to have one point of truth that knows what all the bits of the institution are doing, what their exposure is, and that body can take action for the entire organization to say, we're not going to do this, or we have to do that, because otherwise you risk being caught out.
Thanks. That's so I think what I'm going to do now is, Marianne, I'm going to come back to you in relation to the question of where this sits. Now, Dane gave some insights. Simon was very clear saying, I don't think it sits in the COO's mandate. We had a forum last week where we had 10 heads of operations, and I put this exact question to them. Unanimously, they all said it should sit within the office of the COO, not the chief risk officer. And there were sort of 2 reasons for it. One, they said, if you look from the lens of the chief risk officer, they would naturally look at preventative measures. And actually, Mike pointed out at the beginning that a lot of these risks, you can't prevent them. You've just got to prepare for them. And when they happen, like a pandemic, how are you going to manage that to actually limit damage to your organization? And this is where it pivots into the COO, because the COO has to continue to navigate the business through troubled waters, taking risk, but still looking out for opportunities for productivity and profitability. So that was one reason why they said. And the second was they said the centralized role, the platform of the COO, had visibility and influence over the entire organization, and actually going upstairs had the ear of the CEO to talk to the CEO about just, so what does this mean? So in your organization, how do you define, or indeed do not define, strategic risk? And your function that sits, I think it sits in the chief administration officers, but I'm just wondering the interrelationship you have with the chief risk officer to make sure that there's no tension or duplication in effort.
Yeah, no, great question and great point earlier too about China, because what we are finding in our organization is that you do need a team like ours that can actually weed through a lot of these global issues, brand protection matters, cyber issues, activists, climate change activists, what are they doing? We're all looking at all these threats and taking a step back and saying, okay, what's the risk of all of this to the business? And in the case of China, what we're finding is, reporting that you hear in the West is much different than reporting that you hear in the East. So kind of just having a team that can bring all that together and make sense of it and the impact to the business. So what we have found, it works really well. We're under the chief administrative officer, who is an S&D report to the CEO. And the way it happened at Invesco is that we initially were working on cyber threat intelligence within the security department. But as we were looking at issues such as, physical security matters, and we're in the convergence model, so, all that fits in one space, looking at transportation issues, for example, as far as impact to get to the office. What we're finding is if you delve a little further into why are these people protesting in the first place, you're finding common themes, online, these different groups, Extinction Rebellion groups, you're finding things with other groups, and that can lead to being more proactive about, okay, well, where's the next protest going to happen? So that kind of brings in, not just the COO, but the CRO and, the global comms and different parts of the business. So we're finding that, we can do intelligence and cyber threat intelligence. There are all other aspects of intelligence as well. So that's when we moved out into the chief admin officer under him, only because initially he was over, or still is, over security, technology, and other parts of the business. So in order to reach more customers, we moved out from under security into the larger role of to work with technology, to work with investment services. So for example, we know what our holdings are in terms of, the climate change activism. And because what we're seeing is like with these activists over the past couple of years, they would normally protest just oil pipelines, for example. But now you're finding they're moving away from that and protesting those who are financing the oil pipeline. So having a good understanding of what you're invested in, so you kind of know where to be more proactive in that space, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I do recall there's a good example that to help take us into the right space. You talked about your role in relation to cyber being complementary to working with the CISO, but you're looking at this same problem, but through a different lens.
Absolutely, no, great point. Thank you. Yeah, so for example, we see a lot of different cyber threats happening. You hear about a lot of that in the news. But again, taking a step back and saying, okay, well, what does this mean to us? Do we have that vulnerability that's being exploited? Is there a third-party affiliation? So what we do is we are, in all these working groups, looking internally and externally to see about what cyber threats are, hitting up with potential impact to the business. When we find one, what we'll do is we'll go ahead and get with technology, the head of technology, the CISO and security, and then whoever else needs to be involved. And overnight or ahead of when it actually makes the news, we'll go ahead and determine, is this an impact to Invesco? What are we doing to mitigate it? And we'll put all of that in our global intel briefing. So that morning, COO, CR, everybody is aware of what this potential threat is. And if we need to worry about it, if we do, what are we doing to mitigate it? So everyone's on the same page, because otherwise, as mentioned earlier, you do work in silos. You have the CISO, you have the head of technology, but everyone has to work together to make sure, we are having a holistic view of the threat. Does that answer your question?
Absolutely, and I think what we can see there is it's the bridge between the strategic almost into the tactical is what you're doing there.
That's exactly right. You mentioned earlier, it's like we're opposed to the CRO, who's really high level strategic risk. We're doing a little bit of both by, and I hope y'all could hear me earlier because I know I have some mic issues, but looking day to day, working at a tactical level with technology, with security, with marketing, with brand. And then at the end of the year, kind of looking back at all those tactical issues that we saw throughout the year. And that kind of feeds into our strategic risk, which then the CRO, the CRO is aware of all this going forward and can incorporate that into the corporate risk assessment.
So if I then I'm going to go to Siobhan now, because actually we then actually elevate it into some of the, if we refer to Danes, where you're really looking at elevating again in relation to real strategic risk as well, from looking at actually what the implications were between the US and the Chinese dynamic. Siobhan, when you were the group head of operational risk, if you could imagine now that you're sitting around, and let's not say any of you own it at this moment, you've got the head of the business, you've got the COO, you've got yourself as the group head of operational risk. When you're looking at these risks, how would you actually go through defining and rating them? And actually, and at what point is it do you actually hand over the risk, or how would you actually assess it as the risk committee effectively in giving some form of structure and then response to them?
I think it's a very complex question. I think Marianne brought a lot of interesting points to it. Is there are different views to it. And what she was also talking about is the connectivity between this cyber event and this geopolitical event and what have you. And I think that is where the different points between the first and second line, who has the ability to aggregate across risks, who's got the better ability to deep dive into the specific risks, becomes, I think, really important. Now, you look at the cyber capabilities to dig in very deeply to see broad patterns. But then when you start seeing those broad patterns, when you can start connecting them, it's going to be really important. And one of the things that struck me with what Marianne was also saying is there's not only this ability to start looking where we might be able to see it, but when you start bringing in the social media platforms and the velocity of which news travels, both internal and external, we have less ability to control things as they're developing. And you've got the real threat of bad actor copycats joining the party, which just ups the fray. So I think to your question, Simon, it is really important to make sure that you've got that central communication between those risk points so that you've got people who have the ability to deep dive in, bringing up patterns and specificity, and the people who've got the platform to aggregate are connecting them.
Great. So that's another interesting point, and where I think all the conversations that we had were based upon the assumption that the executive, the board, were having the conversations with the likes of control risk, that you were going in to see the CEO and the CEO's report, and they go, here's the landscape for the next 6 months of the 10 principal geopolitical risks, if we're going to stay in that space. But I think what we're finding is when we then took that assumption and then went to ask the COOs, actually what it hadn't been was digested it hadn't been passed down to the COOs for them to be able to ask the so what. I remember one of the COOs, very senior COOs, saying, well, actually my geopolitical risk map is literally that. It's a poster on the wall that I get in December from one of the principal consultancies, and I have that on my wall. It's sort of with little flags onto the air. And I think that's what we're looking at, is actually it is a strategic risk, but actually it's almost as if, and maybe I'm making the wrong assumption here, that the executive have taken it, it's embedded in their psyche, but it's not then passed down in relation, almost like gathering dust. It's not then passed down to, okay, we've got this data, what does it mean? And therefore, what do we need to prepare for? And we may be preparing, hopefully, for an event that never happens. And actually, that would be a good result. So I want to come back to then Simon, then pivot into Dane on that point again. Simon, is that how, when you were to say Standard Chartered Bank, particularly challenging Standard Chartered Bank, operational in 70 countries, multiple different jurisdictions and dynamics from a cultural perspective and a geopolitical perspective. When you were the COO, what level of data were you getting from the executive board in relation to, we want you to look at this situation and prepare the business for the possibility of an unforeseen event?
Big question, Maurice. I think a couple of points here. I think from a geographic perspective, I was getting a good level of flow from people on the ground as to things that were happening that they were seeing locally that could give potential for concern. But that was through relationship and through dialogue. The key for me did I receive, comprehensive risk information packs that really were scanning the emerging landscape? The answer was, I was not seeing them. However, do information packs exist? And I think this is an important point that's been raised by Marianne, Siobhan, and Dane, is the siloed nature of institutions. Very large organizations, can run in silos, not necessarily intentionally so, but people have a lot on their plate and a big day job. If we go back to the survey work, to what extent are people aware of the information that's available to them within the firm? I'm highly confident that many of the firms that we have spoken to through the survey are receiving from risk consultancies, be it Control Risks or other firms, really insightful information about risks that are out there on the horizon. However, they might be looking at it from a very, very narrow lens of the person who has bought and procured that information. So it might be the person who's thinking about security and premises. It might be the person who's looking at cyber. The key is, how do we know what information is out there so we can then take a step back and take a more informed view across all of it, as Siobhan, Marianne, and Dane have spoken to? It's incredibly unfair to expect, it all sits with the CEO and they receive this big pack of information. Many of the firms, I'm sure, are receiving lots of good information today, but is it being digested and translated and shared accordingly so that people can understand the so what? It's the so what that needs to play out, the so what, the scenario planning to consider What are those severe but plausible scenarios which could arise?
It's actually, that's the so what, this question that's come in here asking exactly that, saying that for the question, as a COO, he says, I find this particularly interesting, but actually, how do I build a business case to bring this into the business without appearing that I am building a kingdom for myself? Yeah, so here's a COO to say, I get this, I get it, and actually we should do it, but if I build a business case, I don't want to be putting my hand up and say, well, actually you're grabbing turf or whatever it is. I think potentially that's the link with operational risk, which hadn't really been tied to it. Well, it certainly wasn't in the dialogue when we were talking about last summer. Mike, do you want to? You've got any thoughts on this, Mike, or in relation to as one COO says, okay, it's the how. How do I go about this?
So first of all, I think there's got to be, and perhaps this would be a good opportunity to segue into the next slide. Actually, if we can just share that with the audience, because getting stakeholder alignment starts, I think, with the question that you can see here. Does the problem exist within the organization? And get the conversation going, perhaps using what might be with China or what happened with COVID as the vehicle to have a discussion about, do we agree as a management team that this problem exists? And to ask the question, how are we looking at strategic risk? How are we doing that? Because it's going to affect me as a COO, as we've said throughout this presentation. And then, Simon and I were talking about this, fundamentally, we've raised a number of these points within the conversation to date. It's about asking the questions that you can see here. But I think the business will get the greatest buy-in if it understands the impact of some of these strategic risks occurring. And so then what I think you've got to do is you've got to understand how you're going to present the potential impacts. And the number one thing that's going to grab everyone's attention is the dollar sign and what potentially that could mean for the organization were some of these strategic risks to take place. So I think my advice would be focus on the impact of strategic risks occurring, focus on trying to measure that. And I think those are going to be the things that will grab people's attention and get the conversation turning. And we've had quite a lot of calls from C-suite organizations over the last 12 months on exactly this topic. Simon, I don't know if you want to chip in on anything that I've said there.
I agree with everything there, Mike. I think if firms are going to ask themselves these questions, by all means, please focus on these questions. But look at question 3. What threat and risk data have we already got? We might not need to reinvent the wheel here. I am highly confident that in many firms, a good level of threat and risk information is already there. So let's understand what is already there and could potentially be reused. But it means you're going to have to, which is what the COOs are very, very skilled at, is work across those silos. Talk to the risk guys, talk to the CISO, talk to the security guys, talk to a Mike Wolf at Control Risks, talk to the procurement guys to understand where have we got a contract to bring it to procure threat and risk information from third parties. I'm highly confident for many firms it's there, but it's not being seen by all of the necessary people who can then, consider, ask the so what, and then translate it into meaningful action plans.
Simon,
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, Simon, I think that's such an interesting point because there's a statistic from FactSet that says 5% of the data that is produced by companies is actually used. So to go out and create more data doesn't always help the situation. And I think if you take your third question, how is it currently used? It ties right back to who needs to own it and why. I'm not so sure we have singular owners anymore. We've got multiple owners of specific parts of the problem that we need
Siobhan, I would agree with you. I don't think we're talking about there being a super individual, because the scale of the different types of risk, the expertise that needed to understand impact, the sheer volume of the data, all of those issues reinforce exactly what you've said there. But I think it starts with acknowledging whether or not there is a problem and coming up with the structures with the right personalities on that team, making sure that that team is senior enough, but not large enough so that we have death by committee, because at some point decisions have got to be made. So I think when Simon's talking about that sort of understanding what threat and risk data you've already got, I think we're talking there about making sure, first of all, it's comprehensive in terms of it's covering everything we need, but understanding how to distill that down and then to use the platforms that we create to help then drive all of the other activities and decision-making and preparedness that organizations need to have. And that's, making sure they've got the right horizon scanning tools, making sure that they are conducting war games. You can't casebook every single type of risk that you're going to have. But what you can get used to be doing is by putting yourself through crisis management exercise or scenario exercises, scenario-driven exercises, is you can put people through situations which engender pressure, that they help engender familiarity with working with each other at a time of a simulated crisis, so that you're not doing this for the first time when it actually happens. And I think that's a really important part of this. But the headline is, we're not necessarily looking to reinvent the wheel, but there's clearly a lot of noise coming out from financial institutions and from the COOs community in particular, that they feel they're the people who get asked to pick up all of the crap that's on the floor, basically, when things start to go wrong. And there's a sense of frustration that they weren't in the loop in some way, shape or form enough before this took place. And I think that's everything that I've taken away from the last 12 months.
And I think that I'm just going to come into to Dane again on this, because the remarkable thing, I remember there was one forum we had with 8 COOs around the table, and I think Control Risk was providing data into 4 of those 8 organizations. Not one of those 4 COOs knew that it had access to that data, which goes back to sort of, it's not reinventing the wheel, or actually sourcing new data. Dane, can I just ask you on that point, when you're presenting to the executive, how much is it sort of how much is it feeding intellectual curiosity about, we should be aware of these things, to actually the C-suite going, okay, that's really interesting, but guide us on what it actually means for us? What does that actually mean for us, and what's your counsel on what we should be doing? How much is that in that spectrum between you go in and you present and you feel you fulfill the objective of feeding their intellectual curiosity, they've got a good understanding of worldwide dynamics, but actually when they walk out that room, how much of that is going to be them thinking, okay, now we've got to go and think about this? I may be unfair here, but I'm just wondering where, and that must be a frustration for you as well, saying, okay, so we can give you this, but we're just not, we can now actually tell you what that actually means, and wherefore what the building blocks of preparation that you need to take.
Yeah, it's a great question. And obviously it varies a bit from group to group. And we also don't see necessarily all the conversations, well, we know we don't see all the conversations that happen internally. So I would say, in my experience, a lot of it is on the first part, which is it's intellectual curiosity with a purpose, but a lot of it seems to be focused on, and I've done China presentations, and you kind of come away thinking, okay, well, what are they going to do with that? They ask good questions, but what then actually happens with it is sometimes not seen by us, or quite often not seen by us, or not clear. And I think part of the, a lot of people on this panel have touched upon these points of decision making and who owns what and the silos. And I think a lot of institutions have put in place assets or structures to help understand what's happening. And I think Marianne's is a good example of that. I think when we've been involved with financial institutions, the main thing has been, okay, you have a lot of sources of information. This was surfaced before. Not everybody sees everything or knows everything that you have. Hopefully you have a function like Marianne's, where it actually distills that information and tells you what's important and has a predictive anticipatory aspect to it, and can tell you the impact, the so what, or at least the potential impacts. But then you have to be able to do something about it. So it's not enough just to understand, you have to be able to act. And having both of those things is really, really rare, not just in financial institutions, but in any of our clients. Quite often they will have the understanding capability. Sometimes they'll have the acting capability. Very rarely are the two together in one institution. When you have the two together and they're working the way they should be, then you are an organization that can be very nimble and adapt and react to disruption, whether it's COVID, whether it's social media, whether it's activism, whether it's political risk. But I would say having those two, and the acting is possibly the hardest because of the siloed nature, because of the thing that Simon surfaced about. I don't want to look like I'm building a separate empire, but being able to act for one institution and having a relatively small number of people that can make that decision, that's really hard. That's probably the hardest thing I would say.
But isn't that why, Dane, we'd be sort of saying, this is why the CRO and the COO need to be sat around that table talking about this. I think Absolutely. you can get too hung up on, so ultimately whose responsibility is it? But I think if you've got an advisor in the shape of the CRO and you've got an executioner in the shape of the COO, you're starting to get there.
Yeah, and I would add also the CAO that Marianne mentioned, right? If you put those, to me, that's the holy trinity, right? If you put those three together, and those three can agree and make a decision and then act for the institution, the organization, whatever kind it is, that's probably the best you will get. I think
well, I'm conscious of the time. We're 90 seconds over. This is a conversation that those listening in, that you can see that it's engaging, and it's engaging, interesting, and I think we've still got a little bit of the journey to go to. I think the conclusions that we've had is that we've recognized, as Siobhan said, when we've been speaking to CEOs, somewhere in the organization they've got this data already, and actually on the whole they've got the tools ready. But actually where we've been working, I think this is where, when I look and when I've listened to the dialogue between, say, Mike and Simon, you've got Simon, ex-COO from a principal organization. Mike was actually from Control Risk, who's been going in with Dane and giving feeding that intellectual curiosity. And I think what we're able to actually do, the bridge, say, we can actually answer what the so what is. So we've been running a series of these forums. I think what we're going to be, hopefully, this is going to prompt some others, because I do think it's a comparatively short step to make a big difference. That's what I think on this, where we've got to. And I think if we can get the CEOs into the understanding that it is a short step and it's fine tuning what you've already got, and we channel that thought and channel that data, then I think that whether it's the chief risk officer or the COO, a lot of the CEOs will say, look, I'm agnostic on that, as long as we address it, whether I own it or not, I don't really care. But actually, Mike said, what I don't want to be in the position is that I'm picking up all the pieces as crisis manager, when we could have actually made that whole journey and that whole experience a lot less painful. So thank you very much indeed for your contributions and the rich conversation. I have a funny feeling that we're probably going to be getting around the table again. Dane, your contribution is fantastic, intellectually stimulating, fulfill my intellectual curiosity anyway. Marianne, Siobhan, thank you. Mike and Simon, for your continued efforts. I have no doubt that we'll be bringing the two of you before the COO community again. Thank you all, and thank you for those who are listening.
Thanks, Boris.
Thank you.
Cheers, everyone.